Sam Harris is one of the four horsemen of New Atheism, having written several books arguing in favor of atheism, including The End of Faith, Letter to a Christian Nation, and Islam and the Future of Tolerance, among other works, the latter of which was co-authored by Maajid Nawaz, and has been featured on Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, and HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher.
You're not going to persuade those people because by their very nature, they're nuts. They're crazy.
They're actually not crazy. That's one of the things I'm disputing.
Kill themselves or think they're going to get 72 virgins, you know, I got to say is insane.
It's actually no crazier, though, than believing that a cracker literally turns into the body of Jesus.
His podcast, formerly named Waking Up with Sam Harris, but now called Making Sense, was making at one point before he shut it down around $15,000 a month. He gets 1 million listeners each episode, according to his own estimates, and the podcast has featured prominent scientists, philosophers, and public intellectuals such as evolutionary biologist, fellow New Atheist, and author of The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins, astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, journalist and author of The Moral Animal, The Evolution of God and Why Buddhism is True, Robert Wright, and the aforementioned Nawaz. However, unlike the other three atheists within the Four Horsemen of Atheism, it could be said that Sam Harris is not self-made. While Professor Richard Dawkins is a renowned evolutionary biologist and science communicator, having written books on biology, Professor Daniel C. Dennett has been a philosopher of science and mind for years at Tufts with books on philosophical issues such as consciousness and free will. And the late, great Christopher Hitchens, while having shifted to being a neoconservative polemicist before his death, Hitch had built a resume as a book critic and a lefty journalist, having written for years in the Minority Report column for The Nation magazine before the attacks on 9/11. Harris, on the other hand, grew up in a privileged setting in California to parents connected to the entertainment industry, with his mother being the creator of the show Golden Girls. Not that this is relevant to his specific views on religion, given that Harris has written plenty of material on atheism and religion through his books and internet articles, and that the other three atheists of the Four Horsemen were already established in other avenues. It's safe to say that Harris is probably the one atheist out of the four atheists who has emerged to have benefited the most out of the New Atheist movement because of his criticism of religion almost 15 years after the New Atheism movement was born. In 2018, Harris was included in a New York Times opinion piece written by conservative and pro-Israeli writer Bari Weiss entitled Meet the Renegades of the Intellectual Dark Web, or IDW for short, which described him as an outspoken Hillary Clinton voter during the 2016 election cycle, alongside other members of the IDW, including evolutionary biologist and ex-Evergreen State College professor Bret Weinstein and his brother Eric, a Teal Capital managing director, both former supporters of Bernie Sanders and right-wing ex-Breitbart writer and Zionist Ben Shapiro, and anti-Trump conservative, in his words, despite nearly agreeing with almost everything the Trump administration has done so far during its first term. Harris has also been described as a liberal who, according to his Wikipedia page, supports raising taxes on the wealthy, the decriminalization of drugs, and same-sex marriage, while criticizing the Bush administration and their war in Iraq, fiscal policy, and views of science. So it's really easy to see how many of his supporters, as well as followers of the intellectual dark web, might consider him one of the few reasonable lefties or liberals of the group. Nevertheless, a few cracks in the window make it clear that this is not so simple. Ignoring for the moment his views on Islam and foreign policy, his liberalism reveals itself to be either A. apologetics for center-right, center-left navel-gazing, or B. apologetics for truly bad ideas, even when he is criticizing bad ideas like Islam, as he likes to say. Full disclosure before going any further, I once considered myself a massive fan of Sam Harris and his books and podcasts, especially when I was getting into the new atheism movement on YouTube in the atheist community and elsewhere in the late 2000s and 2010s. And so, for example, I can understand why some atheists get upset when the term Islamophobia is thrown around to discuss any and all criticisms of the beliefs and views of the religion of Islam and passages from the Quran and the Hadith. A similar pathway from being a fan of Harris to a non-fan was expressed earlier in a YouTube video by user TLJ entitled Why I Stopped Idolizing Sam Harris, linked in the description along with the references. And so I get why some of his more ardent supporters are hesitant to stop worshipping one of their intellectual heroes. For example, Sam Harris makes it clear that he is no fan of the Trump administration, mostly because of his dishonesty, lying, how he speaks and thinks, and how his supporters advocate for white identity politics, even when Trump's fans are no fans of identity politics.
It's the complete ruination of any standard of honesty in political discourse, and it's astonishing to me. He lies more than any person has ever lied in human history, and not only does he get away with it, his audience seems to, his supporters seem to delight in his just running roughshod over any expectation that a public figure would be honest.
Yet even when doing so, he has invited on libertarian political scientists and race science advocate Charles Murray onto his podcast, which was given the name Forbidden Knowledge, which is an odd way to title the episode. For the record, Charles Murray is a New York Times bestseller, has written plenty of books, and is featured on multiple avenues on television, so calling it forbidden, as in Murray's views aren't being aired in broadcast and print media, is a bit misleading. During the episode, Harris barely gave a whiff of a challenge to any statement Murray was making, though I'm almost certain that last comment will get some of Harris's devotees to accuse me of taking it out of context. Harris's soft pass on Murray's views, as well as race realism, was the subject of another Waking Up podcast episode featuring Fox editor-at-large Ezra Klein, where at one point Harris angrily said that the weight of American history is completely irrelevant when discussing modern racism and how marginalized groups are still victimized today, and why dismissing identity politics completely in whole face is not so simple. After that podcast, however, Harris went on to Koch brothers-funded libertarian conservative YouTuber and former contributor to the Young Turks, now Blaze contributor Dave Rubin, to do an episode of the Rubin Report, in which he referred to Vox as a far-left publication. Yet even with articles advocating for what may be referred to as far-left positions, why would a so-called far-left publication like Vox publish an article arguing against single-payer healthcare and free college education by a commentator who previously worked at the Conservative Heritage Foundation and now at the Manhattan Institute, and who's argued for modernizing, in other words, cutting the same language that Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney have used, safety net programs like Social Security and Medicare, which Murray does support, and Harris did not challenge him on this either. If anything, given Klein's previous experience writing for the Washington Post and calling himself a wonk, Fox is probably one of the more establishment outlets on the web. Even more damaging to Sam Harris, just like Trump in 2017 reacting to the events involving white supremacists and nationalists marching in Charlottesville, Virginia, Harris tried to play the both sides card and equate what he called peaceful neo-Nazi protesters to the anti-fascist group Antifa, and once referred to the Black Lives Matter movement as dangerous and dishonest. Worst of all, in the end of faith, Harris downplayed Israel's role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and instead spent most of the time criticizing Hamas, using Israeli talking points about Palestinians using human shields, despite the Israeli Defense Force soldiers doing so. In a failed attempt at an email exchange with MIT linguist and philosopher Noam Chomsky, Harris referred to the United States as a well-intended giant, despite the United States intervening in 6 different wars across the world. More as of right now, with the potential for more war in Iran, a favorite target of the US for years and decades, and prolonging our stay in Afghanistan in the name of democracy for 19 plus years at the time of this recording. And that's not even mentioning the 800 military bases across the world. So instead of having centrist liberals like Ezra Klein or the usual figures in the intellectual dark web, why doesn't Sam Harris just invite a real leftist or progressive for a change, specifically to challenge him on domestic and foreign policy, and how his views on Islam, regardless of how you feel about what's in the Quran or what some followers have committed in the name of the religion, conflict with a liberal foreign policy? We've already seen Harris publish email exchange between himself and Chomsky and Klein, and in all honesty, both times made Sam Harris look insecure. Sam Harris is also on record saying he wouldn't have author and commentator Ta-Nehisi Coates, who has faced criticism from progressive and others on the left, on his podcast because he wouldn't be capable of having an honest conversation, and a fool's errand complained about Coates playing the race card despite racial issues being Coates' expertise in his writings, and saying he needs an intervention.
The reason why I won't have Coates on the podcast is because I think he is incapable of having an honest conversation about race with a white person. He's so inclined to play the race card as a legitimate card. I mean, even the notion of the race card would make no sense to him. It would be a fool's errand to try to reason with him about race, being the lone white guy doing it. He needs an intervention, and that will only be successful, if it's even possible, when done by people who share his identity, and therefore the race card will be inadmissible.
And recommended liberal alternative black commentators who have fair criticisms of Coates coming from African-American intellectuals, such as John McWhorter, who once said that the conservative pro-fracking and anti-prescription drug negotiating Manhattan Institute, where he's worked before, has always been hospitable to Democrats. Anti-Black Lives Matter Brown University economist Glenn Lurie, or New Kid as Harris puts it, and writer for the Libertarian Quillette, Coleman Hughes, who has been featured on Sam Harris's podcast, and the resulting episode with Hughes felt more like a hug box for Harris to defend his side in the Klein debate, and for Hughes to reaffirm his points. With 1 million or so listeners listening to his podcast, Sam Harris has every opportunity to invite genuine progressives, socialists, and leftists to challenge him on race and politics. Case in point, Harris could have invited on Professor Cornel West, as mentioned, a harsh critic of Coates and President Obama as well, to discuss racial politics. After all, just last year, Professor Cornel West was just featured on the Joe Rogan Experience, which host Joe Rogan called one of my favorite podcasts of all time. So far, Sam Harris hasn't invited him on. Harris has the time to invite on a critic of his views on the Israel and Palestinian conflict like Abby Martin, both of whom share a mutual friend in Joe Rogan and has put on a new documentary on the situation in Gaza. But Sam Harris hasn't invited her on. Instead, he's addressed her when she wasn't there to respond. As Nathan J. Robinson wrote in Current Affairs, Sam Harris could have on a whole host of commentators to challenge him on his views outside of the intellectual dark web, but he doesn't. So instead, Sam Harris complains that Glenn Greenwald, a Pulitzer Prize winner for his NSA coverage and also a victim of a public email exchange on Islamophobia, is not a journalist, says that leftist commentator Chris Hedges, whom he debated with previously, also a Pulitzer Prize winner, is a plagiarist, which that accusation is a matter of dispute, and some publications dismiss the allegation against Hedges. an angry lunatic and dishonest for criticizing his thought experiment on a potential nuclear strike on the Muslim world proposed in The End of Faith, and has recently complimented conservative host and Obama conspiracy theorist Glenn Beck. So the only thing to come out of seeing Harris these days compared to when he first started engaging in the public arena with his criticisms of Christianity and Islam is that of a liberal reluctant, or perhaps afraid, to have on genuine progressives and leftist commentators and intellectuals who do not fall under the free-thinking and rational criteria to be part of the intellectual dark web. And that's a real shame for curious-minded skeptics and atheists, considering Sam Harris was one of my role models when, personally speaking, I first started making videos as a YouTube skeptic and atheist who grew out of the new atheist movement and thought more about the broader, more complicated world of politics and foreign policy. Of course, I don't expect this editorial video essay to please the fans and devotees of the books and works of Sam Harris, but I do hope there are those truly open-minded followers of his works to think about the implications of his arguments and works and how they relate to global politics, and to realize that some issues are much more complicated than religion is bad and identity politics is ruining the left, as I have argued previously in the first video. I know that Harris has changed his mind on some issues, case in point his reaction to watching Dirty Wars based on the book by The Intercept journalist Jeremy Scahill. Then again, I expect Sam Harris, who probably wouldn't bother to respond to this, to dismiss this as just another regressive leftist writing a screed. After all, this is the same intellectual high horse who said he preferred current Secretary of HUD Ben Carson over Noam Chomsky for President of the United States.
I mean, given a choice between Noam Chomsky and Ben Carson, right, in terms of the totality of their understanding of what's happening now in the world, I would vote for Ben Carson every time.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Let me know what you think in the comments, or if you just want to say I'm taking something out of context, or whatever. The sources are in the description if you're curious. The best way to support the work on this channel is by subscribing to the channel for future videos.